Hello, this is Leroy Meadows. In this session, we're going to work out some exercises here related to job costing. And we have a number of exercises we want to work out because there's so many different things I want to make sure we understand. So let's go ahead and get started. Exercise 15-3. Following the following are simplified job costing sheets for 3 custom jobs at the end of June for custom patios. All jobs were started in June. Overhead is applied with a predetermined rate based on direct labor costs. Jobs 102 and 103 were finished in June, and job 104 will be finished in July. Now we're asked 3 questions. The first question is, what was the total cost? What was the total cost of direct materials requisitioned in June? So all I have to do in this situation with the job sheets is just add up all the direct materials here. So let's go ahead here and add up my 15,000 from job 102, the $33,000 of materials from job 103, and the $27,000 from job 104. And that'll give me total direct materials for the month of $75,000. So let me go ahead and put that in here. Now let's look at 2, how much total direct labor cost was incurred in June. So let's get our calculator out and we'll do the same thing, add up all our job tickets and take all our job tickets and add up all the direct labor costs incurred throughout the month. So job 102 had $8,000 plus job 103 had $14,200 plus job 104 had $21,000 of labor for a grand total of $43,200 of labor. So $43,200. The third question we're asked is how much total cost is transferred to finished goods inventory in June? So we remember that the jobs that are transferred from work in process to finished goods inventory are what? Their cost of goods manufactured. So we just want to know what was our cost of goods manufactured for June. That's basically what the question is asking. So let's go back to the problem here. And it says all jobs were started in June. Overhead is applied with a predetermined rate based on direct labor costs. Jobs 102 and 103 were finished in June, and job 104 will be finished in July. Okay, so it tells us 102 and 103 are finished. So let's see, I'm going to add up the total costs for job 102 and then total cost for job 103 to get the total amount added. So I had what? Let's see, $15,000 of materials for 102, plus labor $8,000, plus overhead $4,000 right here. Job 103 was also completed. So let's add in the materials, plus the labor, plus the overhead. And I should get a total of $81,300 was my total cost transferred to finished goods inventory. So $81,300 was transferred to finished goods inventory because, again, only jobs 102 and 103 were completed. So an unanswered question, or I could ask, is how much was my ending work in process inventory at the end of June? Because that would be the total of jobs not completed. And we only have one job not completed. So if I was asked what is the balance in finished goods inventory at the end of the month, I would just add in all the materials, labor, and overhead for the jobs not completed. So we have 27,000 plus 21,000 plus 10,500 for a total of $58,500. So that would be my total if I had been asked for what is the cost of work, what is the work in process balance at the end of June. Okay, let's go to our next exercise here. And our next exercise is just, let's get over here. Bell Company produces stainless steel drink tumblers, its only product. These tumblers are stamped with company logos and used as promotional items. Following are simplified job costing sheets for two separate recently completed job lots. Job 1 was for 250 units and Job 2 was for 260 units. Now the first thing we're asked is compute the total cost per unit for Job 1 and Job 2. Okay, so in order to do that, I need to figure out my total costs. So what are my total costs for Job 1? Let's take Job 1 first. I had costs of materials of $425 plus labor costs of $750 plus overhead costs of $900. So what are my total costs? My total costs are 425 plus 750 plus 900. Whoops. $2,075. So that's my total costs. Now, in order to get a total cost per unit, I'm going to take my total costs and divide that by the number of units produced. How many units did I produce in job 1? Right up here, I'm told 250 units. So 2,075 divided by 250. That gives me a unit cost per unit of $8.30. And get this formatted here. And that's what we have for cost per unit. So let's do the same thing for job 2. Job 2, I incurred material costs of $403, labor costs of $780, plus overhead costs of $936. Whoops. For a total amount of $2,119. Oops. Let me click over here, $2,119. Divide that by the number of units produced to get my cost per unit. So how many units did I produce? 260. So when I do that, I take my 2119, divide it by 260. Oops. Divided by 260, not minus. I get $8.15. So $8.15. And that will be, and we just format these here. And that'll be my cost per unit. So the other part of part 1 says which job has a higher total cost per unit, and that would be job 1. Number 2 says compute direct materials cost per unit for each job. Which job has a higher direct materials cost per unit? So we only want the direct materials part per unit. So our direct materials for job 1 was $425. Divide that by 260. And that should give me $1.63 or 250. I'm sorry. I looked at materials for job 1 and divided it by 260, the materials for job 2. And so let's see, 425 divided by 250 gives me $1.70. So $1.70. Materials cost per unit. Now let's take a look at job 2. I have materials unit of cost of $403 divided by the number of units I produced, 260. And that will give me what? 403 divided by 260 gives me a cost of $1.55 per unit. So we go here. So, and then which job has a higher direct materials cost per unit? Again, it was job 1. Materials cost per unit were $1.70 for job 1 and $1.55 for job 2. Now, this next exercise or group of exercises, the next 4 exercises will be combined together because we're going to move from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. So let's go ahead and read the following. The following information is available for ADT Company, which produces special order security products and uses a job order costing system. Overhead is applied using a predetermined overhead rate of 70% of direct labor costs. So first of all, we're asked to set up a raw materials inventory account, T account, and insert the amounts from beginning and ending balances, along with purchases and indirect materials used. And we're to solve for direct materials used in the period. Okay, so I've got all the T accounts for everything set up here. So let's go ahead and take my beginning balance. What's my beginning raw materials balance? $43,200. My ending balance is what? 52,000. Okay. Then costs incurred for the period. Raw material purchases, 210,000. So I'm going to put that here with purchases. And then we had indirect materials used of $15,000. Now I'm asked for the cost of direct materials used. So what I'm going to do here is take my beginning balance in raw materials, 43,000, and actually it should be 43,000, not 43,200. Plus my purchases of 210,000, and that gives me my raw materials available for use. Now from that, I'm going to subtract out the indirect materials used, and I'm going to subtract out my ending inventory. And the remainder gives me my direct materials used for the period, $186,000. Now, let's go ahead, and you might be wondering, how did I come up with that? So let's just verify our results. 43,000 plus 210,000 minus 15,000. Oops, I hit 21,000 instead of 210. 43,000 plus 210,000 minus my 15,000 of indirect materials used, minus my direct materials used of 186,000. And does that leave me with 52,000? Yes, it does. So I plugged in my number to back into this to make sure that my calculation was correct. Okay, so that's how I got. So that's what I got for that. $186,000 for direct materials used. Okay. Number 2, compute the cost of direct labor used for the period. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, let's look. Are we given factory or direct labor used? We're given factory payroll, but we're given indirect labor used, but we're not given direct labor used. Well, luckily for us, we can figure that out. So I'll take my total factory payroll, because my factory payroll for factory is either going to be direct or indirect, right? There's no third option. So from that, I'm going to take my 345,000 minus my indirect labor, and let me format this here, minus my indirect labor, and how much was that? $15,000. So $15,000. So that gives us what here? I'm sorry, that was $80,000. I was looking at indirect materials. 80,000. Come on, Leroy. Okay, 345,000 minus 80,000 gives me payroll of $265,000, of which that is our direct labor cost. So $265,000. Okay. Part 3, set up a work in process inventory T account and insert amounts for beginning and ending balances along with direct materials used from Part 1, direct labor used from Part 2, and applied overhead. Solve for cost of goods manufactured in this period. Okay, so let's label these so we know what we're doing here. So our beginning work in process inventory, I can go up here and see it was 10,200. In fact, I'm going to move this down just a little bit here. Is what? $10,200. Now, what components increase work in process? Well, our direct labor. Let's put DM for direct labor, or GL for direct labor, DM for direct materials, and OH for overhead. So you understand my abbreviations here. So my direct materials were 186,000. My direct labor is how much? We just calculated that in number 2, 265,000. Now, how much overhead was applied? Well, we weren't given the exact amount that was applied, but we were given how to solve for that. Overhead is applied using a predetermined rate of 70% of direct labor costs. So what I'm going to do is take my 70% of my direct labor costs, $265,000, and multiply that by 0.70. And that will give me overhead applied of $185,500. So $185,500. And then my ending work in process balance was $21,300. So to solve for work in process, I'm going to approach it the same way or similar way as I did for raw materials. Take my beginning balance, 10,200, plus my direct labor or direct materials of $186,000, my direct labor of $265,000, plus my overhead applied of $185,500. And that gives me total work in process of $646,700. Subtract out my ending inventory, and my cost of goods manufactured will be $625,400. So $625,000 is my cost of goods manufactured. Okay. Now the next one, set up a finished goods inventory T account and insert amounts for beginning and ending balances along with cost of goods manufactured from Part 3. Solve for cost of goods in the sold cost. Solve for cost of goods sold in the period. Do not consider any underapplied or overapplied overhead. Okay. So my finished goods, I'm going to have a beginning balance here. And how much of my beginning balance and finished goods and my ending balance, I can look over here, 63,000 was my beginning balance. Add to that my cost of goods manufactured because that was just the amount transferred from work in process to finished goods, 625,400. And my ending balance in finished goods, not including the over and under applied overhead, was what? 35,600. So what I'm asked to do is determine cost of goods sold. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take my beginning balance, 63,000, plus my cost of goods manufactured, 625,400, and subtract out my ending inventory balance, 35,600. And that should give me cost of goods sold, $652,800. There we go. And that is my cost of goods sold. Now 5, set up a factory overhead T account and insert amounts for indirect materials used, indirect labor used, other overhead costs, and applied overhead. Solve for under applied and over applied. So we're not, okay. So my factory overhead would have been started with 0 because we restart that at the beginning of the month or at the beginning of the period. So I have no carryover. So I'm going to do what? IM for indirect materials. And how much was that? We were told $15,000. IL for indirect labor, and we were told what? 80,000. And I can get it from either my T accounts here, and then the amount here, or I can just, where I'm getting, I can get some of this is for here. So indirect labor and 80,000 other overhead costs. I indirect overhead, and I'll just put overhead here of 120,000. Okay. Now, how much? Let's see. With the overhead and applied overhead. Solve for under and over applied. Okay, so how much overhead did we apply? Well, we applied what? 185,500. This is what we went through here. So 185,500. Let me just move this over here a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is add up all my debits here, 15,000 plus 80,000 plus 120,000, and that gives me 215,000 minus the 185,500 already applied, and that gives me a debit balance or under applied overhead of $29,500. And I'm under applied because I have a debit balance here after I take into account everything else. Had I had a credit balance in the account, it would have been over applied. So that is exercise 15-12. We just finished up with step 5. We computed the under applied overhead of $29,500. Now, let's look at the next exercise here. Exercise 15-13. And we are to calculate, or not calculate, but use information in the previous exercise 15-12 to prepare journal entries for the following events of the period. The raw materials purchased for cash, direct materials used, and indirect materials used. Okay, so when I make my purchase, I'm going to journalize this, or this right here, beginning has already been journalized. This, I'm going to journalize my purchases, direct materials used, and my indirect materials used. Okay, so when I make purchases, I'm going to debit raw materials inventory. For the amount of the purchases, we have that $210,000. And let's see, we told they were paid for with cash, so $210,000, and that's my journal entry. Record materials purchases. Okay. The second thing we need to journalize is direct materials used. So what direct materials do we use? Well, we're given that here, direct materials used, $186,000. So remember, direct materials usage goes to work in process. So I'm going to debit work in process inventory for the amount of direct materials, $186,000. And I'm going to credit raw materials inventory. $486,000. And for my notes, record direct materials used. Okay. Now we need to record the indirect materials used. Now, whereas direct materials were transferred directly to work in process inventory, indirect materials are transferred to factory overhead. So I'm going to debit factory overhead, $15,000, and then credit raw materials inventory for $15,000. And my note is going to be record indirect materials used. So that is the journal entry, or these are the journal entries, rather, for the materials and how we would handle when we purchase it, the usage of direct materials, and the consumption of indirect materials. Now, let's look at the next exercise. The next exercise says, use information exercise 1512 to prepare journal entries for the following events for the period. Direct labor used and indirect labor used. Okay, I thought I copied that from there, so let me get rid of that. We know that my direct labor used was what? $265,000. So I'm going to record, and remember, direct labor, just like direct materials, is incurred and accumulated in work in process inventory. So debit work in process inventory for the amount of 260, and what was that amount? $265,000, because I'm gathering that here. And what are we going to credit? Factory wages payable, $265,000. So, and there we go. Now, for number 2, let's go back and let's take a look here. And we were told that indirect labor was $80,000. So, where are we going to accumulate indirect costs? Factory overhead. So I'm going to debit factory overhead for $80,000. And then I'm going to credit factory wages payable. And to record indirect labor used. And then for this one, I'll put the note in here to record direct labor used. And again, how did I get that amount? Well, we did that 2 exercises ago and we split that up. Total factory payroll is $345,000. $80,000 of it was indirect labor, and then we calculated direct labor of $265,000. Okay. Now let's take a look at exercise 15-15. Okay, so what we have here is use information to prepare journal entries for the following events for the period. Incurred or other actual overhead costs, all paid in cash, and then applied overhead to work in process. Okay, so remember in factory overhead, our debits are the actual cost of overhead incurred, and this is the amount applied to the different work in process jobs that we've completed. So, okay. So let's take a look here. So all that is going to be factory overhead. And how much did we do in factory overhead? Total overhead, $125,000 or $120,000, because that was the journal entry. And why are we only doing $120,000? Because these were actual overhead costs. We already recorded the indirect labor of $80,000, the previous exercise, and the one right before it is $15,000. If you see, let me go back here. Yep, there we go. I recorded it here, and I've also recorded it here. So those, the 15,000 here and the 80,000 here have already been recorded. That's why I'm only doing, so these two have already been recorded. That's why I'm only dealing with this. So factory overhead, and they said they were all paid for in cash. So $120,000 to record, oops, record actual overhead incurred. Now, the second one we were asked is to applied overhead to work in process. Okay, so this is that applied that we did. So I applied it to work in process. So that's why I'm going to debit work in process inventory. Oops. For what? $185,500. And then we're going to credit factory overhead for $185,500 to record applied overhead. Now, there is one thing I'd like to go and do an extension of. And this is not in the problem here, but let me go ahead and add this here. Now remember that we were under applied by 29,500. So what if I wanted to record that under applied overhead? What would I have to do? Well, remember, and I said that for our purposes, we're going to charge them off and bring it to a zero balance by putting it in cost of goods sold. So I could just cost of goods sold and $29,500 and factory overhead $29,500, and that would be the way that I closed out and brought this to a zero balance. So if I wanted to go one step further, we weren't asked for that, but we can easily do that here since we already have this amount. And if I credit factory overhead, that will give me a zero balance my factory overhead if I was going to close it out for the period, and it would go to cost of goods sold. And let's say this had been an over applied account or over applied situation, I would then just debit factory overhead and credit cost of goods sold. So, okay, that is exercise 15-15. And let's take a look at exercise 15-17. Shire Company predetermined overhead rate is based on direct labor. Management estimates that the company will incur $747,500 of overhead costs and $575,000 of direct labor costs for the period. During March, Shire began and completed Job 56. We're asked two things. What is the predetermined overhead rate for the period? And then two, use the information on the following job sheet to determine the total cost of Job 56. Okay. So what do we remember about our predetermined allocation rate? Is our estimated overhead costs divided by our estimated and allocation base. In this case, it's based on direct labor costs. So direct labor costs. So what I'm going to do is take my estimated overhead costs, which will be what, $747,500. And let's get rid of that. So 500 divided by, based on direct labor costs, and $575,000 of direct labor costs for the period of 575. So I divide that out, and I take 747,500, divide it by 575,000. I'm going to get 130%, or I can do 1.3. So 1.3, and I can just format that as a percent if I want to. So for every dollar of direct labor costs incurred, I'm going to have $1.30 of overhead applied to this. So now we're asked to solve for, let's see here. We're asked to solve for, let's see, the total cost of job number 56. So what's our direct materials? Well, we have the direct materials here on the job cost sheet, but they're not totaled. So I guess we're going to have to do that. So let's take a look here. 5,000 plus 7,000 plus 3,640, and our direct materials usage is $15,640. Now our direct labor is what? 700 plus 1,250 plus 1,250, getting that right here. And that will give me a total direct labor of $3,200. And let me format this appropriately real quick. Now overhead. Now, so I'm going to take this $3,200 and multiply that by 130%, or 1.3. So $3,200 times, times 1.3 will give me overhead applied to the job of $4,160. So $4,160. So my total cost for the job should be 15,640. And I'll just add up my materials, labor, and overhead. I'll just add all these up here. 15,640 plus 3,200 plus 4,160 will give me a total, the job cost for number 56 of $23,000. Whoops, wrong cell here. And wrong cell again. There we go. And that's my total cost of job 56. Okay, let's go to the next exercise here. And I know that we had previously done an exercise with recording journal entries, but I want to do this because we're going from beginning to end and putting it all together. Okay, so let's take a look, and we're just going to record these as journal entries. This is exercise 15-18. All we have to do is prepare journal entries for these transactions. Okay, so the first one is raw materials purchase on credit, $90,000. So what am I going to do? I'm going to debit raw materials inventory for $90,000, and it was purchase on credit, so accounts payable, $90,000. Okay, the next one, direct materials used, 36,500, and direct materials used, 19,200. Okay, so we really could do this as a compound journal entry. And let me add a few more cells here, add a few more rows here. And clear formatting. Okay. Get rid of these. Okay. Why can I get it? Okay. So anyway, besides that, let's just forget about that. Direct materials used 36,500. So what are we going to do? Direct. What am I doing? Direct materials go to work in process inventory. So process inventory for 36,500, and we would credit what? Raw materials inventory for $36,500. Now that would be for our direct materials, and our indirect materials would be what? They go to what? Factory overhead. And how much are their indirect materials used? 19,200 is we're told right here in the problem. So 19,200, and working, why am I doing that? Raw materials inventory, 19,200. So I can do that here and just separate and put a specific transaction for this. Now, and then direct labor use 38,000 and direct labor use 12,000, record using factory wages payable. Now I could do this as two separate transactions, or if you remember from financial accounting, we can do a compound journal entry. So I think for illustrative purposes, I want to go ahead and do that. So debit work in process inventory for the amount of the direct labor used, and we're told that's what, $38,000. And for the indirect labor used of $12,000, we would debit factory overhead. That was what, $12,000. And then we would credit what? Factory wages payable for the total amount. And let's see, 38,000 plus 12,000 is going to be 50,000. So I really could do that. So I have the work in process here for materials. I did a separate entry for direct materials and indirect materials. And here I just did a compound journal entry for direct labor, indirect labor combined, and then just credited factory wages payable for the total. Now D is we paid cash for other actual overhead costs, $11,475. Now normally we would break this down between for each, each individual thing for credit and everything else like that. But since we have, we're told one, we paid cash for it, but two, there's no depreciation in anything, so we're assuming no depreciation in this company. So what am I going to do for these other overheads? I'm going to debit any other overhead, gets debited to factory overhead for the amount of $11,475, and it said we paid cash of that amount. Okay. E, applied overhead at the rate of 125% of direct labor costs. Okay, what were my direct labor costs? We're told here $38,000. So I'm going to take that $38,000 times 1.25, and that'll give me overhead applied of 47,500. Now, when I'm actually applying overhead, I'm going to debit work in process inventory. The accumulation of overhead is a debit to factory overhead. In the application of overhead is a credit to factory overhead and a debit to work in process inventory. For 47,500, and we'll credit factory inventory 47,500. Now F, transferred cost of jobs completed to finished goods 56,800. So what am I going to do? I'm going to debit with this one. We're transferring it from work in process inventory to finished goods. So I'm going to debit finished goods inventory of what, 56,800, and I'm going to credit work in process inventory 56,800. Okay, G, sales of jobs on credit was $82,000. So I'm going to do what? Debit accounts receivable, because we sold the job, but they're not paying us today, so we sold it on credit, $82,000, and I'm going to credit sales or sales revenue, whichever your company uses or whatever the book chooses to offer you. And then H, cost of jobs sold was 56,800. So I'm going to debit cost of goods sold, 56,800. I'm expensing them off, so I'm moving. Where am I removing them from? Finished goods inventory, 56,800. So that is all the journal entries combined. And I wanted to do it all together because that way you see how all the journal entries be made at the end of the period or at the end of the month or whenever you need to do that. Okay, so let's take a look at exercise 15-28 next. And this is going to be our last exercise here. Sophia Gomez runs a mobile pet grooming service. She charges $35 direct labor per grooming hour. She applies overhead to jobs on the basis of grooming hours. She predicts 800 grooming hours for the year. Her estimated overhead costs for the year are as follows, and they give us this right here. And then we're asked, compute the predetermined overhead allocation rate using estimated grooming hours. Okay, so let's determine our overhead costs. So what are our estimated overhead costs? Well, we're given all that right here. So 5,500 plus the 1,200 plus 1,000 plus 600 plus 350 plus 950 gives me $9,600 of overhead costs. So $9,600. And we're told it's going to be allocated on the basis of direct labor hours. She predicts 800 grooming hours for the year. So we're going to take that 9,600, divide it by 800 hours, and that will give me an overhead rate of $12. Oops. Of overhead applied for each hour of direct labor grooming hour that we're using. So let's take a look at number 2. Sophia has been asked to groom 3 large dogs. She expects this job to require a total of 12 direct labor grooming hours. Compute her total cost, direct labor, because remember in a service company we don't have direct materials, so our total cost can be direct labor plus applied overhead for the job. So grooming labor. So what are we given here? She charges $35 per direct labor grooming hour, so we're going to take that. $35 times the number of hours that she expects to be incurring of direct labor, and that's 12. So times 12. And so we're anticipating $420 of grooming labor. Now for overhead, remember that for every hour of overhead, we're going to apply $12. So as in a previous example, we did based on direct labor costs. This one is going to be based on direct labor hours. So you always want to pay attention for that. So I'm doing what? $12 per hour of overhead incurred times the number of direct labor hours we expect to incur, $12 or 12 hours, gives me overhead applied of $144. So when I combine my grooming labor and my overhead costs, plus 420, I'm going to get a total job cost of $564. Now, if Sophia targets a markup of 25% on the total cost for each job, what price should she quote for the job in part two? Okay, so we're going to take that cost, the total cost of the job for part two, $564, and we're going to multiply that by the markup rate of 25%, so point times 0.25, and that'll give me a markup of $141. So the price quote Sophia is going to be giving is going to include her total cost of the job plus her markup or her desired profit, and 141 plus 564. So she is going to quote for the job of grooming those three dogs $705. And that is the price that she is going to quote. So, okay, that concludes this video. Thank you and have a good day.